Hi everyone, welcome to Free Kiwis. I'm here with my usual co-host, Dr. Michael Johnston.
Hello.
And also with our guest, Steph Martin from the Free Speech Union and also from the New Zealand Initiative.
Thanks, James. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations, you're the first guest on Free Kiwis to have been on the show 3 times.
I'm truly honoured.
She's an honorary co-host by now, really.
Honorary co-host.
Yeah.
And we're calling this a trialogue, but I'm actually going to become a New Zealand citizen tomorrow. So we could just rename Free Kiwis 3 Kiwis.
That's a good idea.
But for the time being, it's still Free Kiwis, and we're having another trialogue. So we're very lucky to be in this beautiful studio, thanks to our friend Guy Quartermain. And today we just had an idea of discussing some things that have been on our minds. So one of them, I think, is Trump. We're having lots of really interesting discussions at the New Zealand Initiative about Trump. Our colleagues Roger Partridge and Oliver Hartwich have written a lot of very tough articles criticizing Trump for good reasons. I think all of us here are very worried about Trump. I'm worried about Trump as a Canadian. Trump has obviously had a huge impact on what used to be called the Western Alliance. It's an open question now whether that's even a thing anymore. So lots of concern for anyone who's worried about the future of liberal democracy, on which, of course, free speech depends. So let's start with what your thoughts are on this, Michael, because I understand that you also are extremely concerned about Trump, but you also think that we need to understand Trump as a figure, right?
I think we need to understand why he has come to power. I think that has to be part of the context of looking at what he's actually doing. So, yes, I share with our colleagues, and I think with you, his concern about his assault on the global security order. I would add to that the global trade order with this tariff business, which no economist I've ever spoken to thinks is a good idea. It's likely to inhibit prosperity around the world.
Including for American consumers.
Including for American consumers, and certainly for us in New Zealand, it's going to present some challenges. We're a trading nation. But I do think that we need to contextualise the criticisms of Trump in understanding why he has come to power. And we need to do that for a number of reasons. First of all, I think that because he came out quite early as being against, what is called wokeism, there are a lot of people applauding him purely for that. Now, I also applaud him for that, in as much as I think that was a different kind of threat to democracy and certainly to open society, with people being cancelled, with people's careers being ruined. And I think the left has to take an enormous amount of responsibility for the rise of Trump in that regard. First of all, the American Democrats, for their failure to put up a candidate who's even half decent. They got lucky with Joe Biden, but really, for 3 elections now, they've put up candidates who really ought not deserve to win. And had they put up better candidates, Trump probably wouldn't have been a thing.
So by better, do you mean more centrist? Candidates who would have appealed to some of the people who voted for Trump?
That's right, who maybe spoke to middle America a bit more. I mean, the Democrats were supposed to be traditionally a left-wing party, a party of the workers, and yet Trump has got overwhelming support from the American working class. And it's not surprising when people like Hillary Clinton described middle America as a basket of deplorables, and it just kind of went from there. There's been unrelenting assault on, white heterosexual men from the left for a long time, and Trump is the result of that. Sorry, guys, it's all your fault if you're going to do things like that. So that has to be part of the conversation, because otherwise people are going to stop distinguishing between opposing that left-wing authoritarianism and being a Trump supporter.
Right. So this is my real worry. This is kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about on this podcast, because I think it's a particular worry in New Zealand and especially in Canada. Because what's happened in Canada is that Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, had a huge lead on the Liberals. And then as soon as Trump started attacking Canada, that lead basically overnight evaporated.
And reversed.
And so the danger, in reverse, so that, I think it's now sort of touch and go. But the danger is that sort of bakes some wokeism into the Canadian national identity, because now people are going to think, Trump is anti-woke, so anyone who's anti-woke is a Trumpist. Trump is anti-Canada, so anyone who's anti-woke is anti-Canadian. And I think actually nothing could be further from the truth, because of course Canada has a grand tradition, like other liberal democracies, of free speech and being the kind of country where you can't just tear people down and get them fired for their jobs for saying things that they think about politics or religion or sexuality. So this is something we're really going to have to watch in New Zealand as well, because I think certain people are going to look at any kind of reasonable critics of wokeness as Trumpists, And I think we're very keen to say that this is not the case of us, and it's not the case for a lot of other decent people who just want to live in a country where you can speak your mind and make jokes without being persecuted.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump has done a lot of things in the past that, some people have argued ought to have ruled him out from even contention in this election, most particularly his failure to condemn the Capitol riots 4 years ago.
Not only that, he pardoned a lot of those people.
He pardoned a lot of the people. So he's done a huge number of egregious things. But, when he won the second election, it was kind of fair and square. He won a popular majority. The Republicans won both houses. And he came in with an indisputable mandate from the American people. And so, to some extent, my jury was out about what a second Trump presidency would be like. Well, I was disabused of any uncertainty in short order. First of all, he threw Ukraine under the bus. Then he started an unimaginable campaign against Canada, saying that they ought to be a state of America, and wanting Greenland from
their
Denmark.
car industry should be permanently destroyed.
Yeah. I mean,
which is also going to come at the cost of American
so
consumers.
he's shown himself to be extremely authoritarian.
Yeah.
And as our colleague Oliver has pointed out, he raises the spectre of Carl Schmitt, the Nazi political theorist, who liked the idea of a world that was characterized by a few large powers with spheres of influence, which they dominated. And that, I fear, is where we're headed with him.
And also
now.
Another key Schmittian idea is that the sovereign is he who decides upon the exception.
That's right.
The exception being the exception to normal constitutional norms. And now we hear Trump, just to speak to your point about authoritarianism, we hear Trump openly saying that it's not a joke, his words, he is thinking about a third term and there are ways of doing this. And of course, that's against the American Constitution. It has been since after FDR. After Roosevelt had 3 terms, they introduced the constitutional.
3 terms.
That's right. I mean, before that, it was just a convention, right? Abraham Lincoln, George Washington had, the first president, only had 2 terms. And after that, nobody presumed to take 3 terms. FDR won 3 terms. He actually won 4 elections.
He had the third
died
term.
soon after his 4th electoral victory.
It was
and then
World
they
War
introduced
II, so
whatever
it
amendment
was
it was.
kind of exceptional circumstance.
Yeah, right. And you might argue, FDR was a great president in lots of ways, the New Deal. But anyway, it's very clear in the Constitution that you can't have 3 terms, and Trump is now broaching that. So, Steph, one question I have for you, I guess, is you work for the New Zealand Free Speech Union as well as the New Zealand Initiative. So I was just wondering, how are you guys thinking about this? Because obviously you have a lot of supporters who maybe, some of them like Trump, some of them don't like Trump. How do you sort of, and you're against sort of cancel culture, you're pro free speech in the States. Obviously you're going to like, and your members are going to like some of the things that Trump is doing. But
yeah, well, I think there's very high emotionality around the whole thing at this point in time, because everyone's sort of aware that there is a tension in the air, right? But I mean, we part of the whole point of the Free Speech Union is that we're oriented towards free speech as a principle. So we wouldn't really look to take a stance on one side or the other per se. It's more about what are the conditions under which we can kind of be productive in the face of significant upheavals to social cohesion, and what are the things that we can hold on to look to bring us together and to look to kind of establish security, like social cohesion
That's really interesting. So I think you're right to sort of think about this in a frame of social cohesion, because obviously one of the things that's been going on and that preceded the rise of Trump has been this vast polarization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially in America, right?
Yeah, and that's a question I wanted to you mentioned a minute ago about what Trump's come in with is a mandate from the American people to act.
Well, largely, I think it was an economic mandate.
Yeah. So the question there is why? What created that situation, right? That we're in, that we've got him here with a mandate. What are the circumstances that have generated
That's right.
that kind of a result? What is that telling us about where people are at? And I think there is an enormous amount of frustration out there. And I think a lot of people are just not feeling seen or heard or represented. And I think that there's a huge sense that the political structures have been corrupted and there is a lack of transparency in our governmental systems.
I think you're perfectly right.
And so I think those are really things that we need to address. And transparency of government is a really critical aspect.
And we can look at other countries for similar phenomena.
Yes.
So
if you go
to the UK, you now see Nigel Farage's party Reform on roughly level pegging with Labour and the Tories, to about 25% each. It all fluctuates around a bit, but that's another manifestation of the same issue. In Germany, you've got the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD. Which the other parties have kind of quarantined and won't have anything to do with. But it also now commands nearly a quarter of the vote. And that hasn't risen in a vacuum. It's arisen because a whole lot of people, especially from the old eastern provinces, felt ignored by the Christian Democrats and the SPD.
Yeah, and that seems to be all around one issue, right, which is immigration. So I often think that if the mainstream parties had just tackled the topic of immigration openly, then that would have instantly killed the AfD, right? And because they didn't, the AfD can also get sort of further support by saying, oh, this is something the main parties don't want you to talk about. And in a sense, they have a point. And then what's happened is, in fact, very dangerous, right? Because the AfD started out just being more moderate and maybe talking about reducing immigration. And now there's this flugel, this sort of wing of the party that it's fairly extreme in using sort of Nazi reminiscent language.
Yeah.
And so, again, we have a phenomenon where people want to be represented and they're very frustrated. And if you kind of block that, if you don't give that a vent or way out, then things can get ugly and they can shift in a direction that's unpredictable.
Absolutely. This is why people need to be able to exercise their voice, right? This is why freedom of expression is important, because otherwise people just feel trapped and suppressed.
Exactly.
And that doesn't go nowhere.
Yeah.
No,
right? It just goes underground.
And now, that's quite right. And now we've got a risk of an assault on free speech from a different quarter. Already there have been some censorious moves from the Trump administration against the courts, against universities. And look, I don't think Trump is any friend of free speech. The enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. We could make, we could make common cause perhaps over his pushback against the woke excesses, and I do applaud that. I think it's high time. But it's no better if he just replaces it with a different form of anti-democratic authoritarianism.
I've read about some pro-Palestine protesters at American universities who have, by the way, every right to protest peacefully, as long as they don't cross certain lines, who I think have just been completely expelled from the country in a way that I think some of the courts have even tried to strike those down, and the Trump administration has just gone ahead anyway. So to me, that's just highly irresponsible, and obviously it's not what we want to see as a sort of free speech podcast in the English-speaking world.
I mean, one of the things, maybe my understanding of this is actually quite limited, so maybe you could help me to build on it, but he is trying to, as far as I can tell, sort of draw out some of the aspects of government that have been kind of hidden for quite a long time and bring more transparency.
What they call the deep state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something I'm just thinking about, trying to kind of bring a balanced perspective about this. Are there good things that he's doing that we can look at and say, yes, that's probably a good action? That to me seems like...
Well, I think ending the DEI, the diversity, equity and inclusion thing, which has been a huge scam for elites from certain minorities to reap benefit without merit. I think it's great that he's ending that. The Doge thing, the government efficiency thing, in principle, that's a good idea. There is no doubt a huge amount of fat in the American public administration. However, for one thing, that's only going to scratch the very surface of their massive structural deficit, because most of that is in welfare entitlements. So that's one thing. And another thing is, if you want to kind of get the government running more efficiently, the first thing you do is not cut a whole lot of employees at random. And that's because unless you cut the functions that they're supposed to implement, all you end up with is fewer people trying to implement all of these functions. The first thing to do is to identify all the functions, get rid of the functions, and then cut the staff to fit that.
I guess what I was getting at wasn't so much government efficiency so much as government transparency, like people knowing what's going on in the government.
Right. Well, that's nice rhetoric, but I haven't seen any results of it, so I'm not sure whether that will actually eventuate.
Would you both be in agreement that that's not something that's actually happening in earnest?
I don't know.
I haven't looked into that enough to know, to be honest. But I did in some ways I liked the fact that they made public this whole tranche of documents around JFK, I think, like the moon landings, all these things. Not because I actually think there's anything dodgy about our understanding of who killed JFK or the moon landings or anything. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist in that way myself. However, I do think that the way you combat this kind of thinking isn't to sort of keep things secret.
Well,
and I think that if you make all this information public, then everyone online and wherever they are can look through this material. And probably a few of them are going to keep saying crazy things anyway. But like a lot of them are probably just going to see this material and be like, oh, okay, there actually isn't a conspiracy. Like, I think that's kind of helpful.
Secret, you invite conspiracy theory, don't you?
Yes, but that's what I mean. So if I think what I was really getting at is that moves to make things more transparent and less secret from the government side of things.
Well, to the extent that he does that, great.
Yeah, I think that's a positive.
I mean, I do wonder about people like Elon Musk. I mean, in some ways, I supported Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and the changes he made when he made it X. But he's also like a very unreliable ally on free speech and on transparency too, right? And I'm increasingly suspicious that he's someone who, you have to remember, he's a very wealthy man. He's, in fact, the world's wealthiest man. He has his own interests, and he's probably going to try and protect them. So I myself am now, kind of like Michael, I was never completely sympathetic with Trump. I always kind of disliked Trump as a person and as a politician. But when he first came in, I thought maybe, he's a gigantic asshole, but maybe he'll do some good things. And now I'm increasingly suspicious of the rhetoric. However, at the beginning of the podcast, I did say we wanted to sort of have a balanced discussion about Trump. So let's just try and do that. I mean, if we were to steel man Trump, like one thing I would say is that obviously a large part of the Trump phenomenon are these people in the Rust Belt, right? These people who are kind of disenfranchised. These industries moved out of town. There are huge swathes of America that are like that. These are working class people, often working class white people, white men, and they're a demographic that maybe hasn't been the focus of a lot of political rhetoric and political action, and they're humans too, right? And so one of the things I think Trump is trying to do with his tariffs is to keep industries in the States or bring manufacturing back to the States. Now, as you say, like most professional economists would say, that's actually going to hurt everybody in the long run because everyone's going to be worse off. However, in sort of relative terms, you might say it's better if you're one of these guys who's lost his job in a steel mill to have some kind of a job and to be kind of on the ladder rather than to be competing against all these people in the third world.
Yeah. I mean, I think this comes back to a long-standing problem with the globalized economy, which by and large I support. And the reason that I support it is because it has a demonstrable history of raising people around the world out of poverty. The fact that the wealthy West exported a lot of its industry to places like China and India is a large part of the reason that hundreds of millions of people are no longer on the absolute poverty line in those countries. However, I don't think it was managed all that well because nobody thought, oh, what happens to all the people who lose their jobs in the wealthy West as a result? And what the political ramifications of that will be. Well, now we're seeing what the political ramifications of that are. So I think that while on the whole, the globalized economy has been good for combating poverty around the world, in local places that have lost industry, that has been a huge problem. And by and large, governments have not done a good job of addressing that problem or seeing it coming or taking any account of it once it started to manifest. So,
yeah, I definitely think that that's true what you said, and that there is actually a strong moral argument that the interest of the poor labor in China or India or indeed sub-Saharan Africa, where they have very little growth and they're living in levels of poverty which we would struggle to survive in the Western world, that those people have a stronger claim maybe than the guy who's laid off from his steel mill. However, this is when I go back to trying to steel man Trump, even though I don't really feel inclined to. But you might say, well, Trump is the president of the United States of America. And this is something he's always been unapologetic about.
That's true.
And in some ways, I kind of understand this, right? It's like he's not the president of the world. He's not there to represent poor laborers in India and China. He's there to make the situation better for people in the States. And I would even add to that, I think a lot of people freaked out and still do about the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And even though I can see why it's associated with a lot of things I deeply dislike, but the actual slogan to me has always seemed kind of banal. And for me, it was almost kind of a tell. It was revealing that the elite intellectuals disliked that so much. Because I almost thought, well, what do you expect an American president is going to do?
Going to say,
and I would say that, if there was a slogan, "Make Canada Great Again," sure, that seems kind of ordinary to me.
Jingoistic and a bit annoying.
Okay, a little bit jingoistic, but I think that a lot of people all over the world, it's a natural human tendency to be a little bit patriotic.
And I can absolutely
think that your country
see.
is more important.
I can absolutely see why the the white working class man who has lost his industry is incredibly angry at the East Coast elites who, sitting in their ivory tower universities, the feminist professors with tenure, looking down on him and saying, not only have the likes of you caused all the problems of the world, you've got white male privilege. Even though he's lost his job and they're sitting in tenured university positions. Of course he's angry, and of course he's looking for a way to vent that anger. And Trump has absolutely made himself a lightning rod for that.
Okay.
And I can understand their point of view perfectly.
That's perfect. Okay, so I wanted to get back to social cohesion because that's something you rightly raised. So this has been something that people are talking about at the moment in New Zealand, right?
Yeah, so there was it was released last week, I believe. The Helen Clark Foundation have recently produced a report on social cohesion in New Zealand that seems to indicate some pretty troublesome things, some concerning statistics around migration, but also an indication around Kiwis actually being sort of increasingly inclined towards authoritarianism as a desirable kind of political
Right. I've seen surveys.
structure.
Yeah, I've seen references to surveys of this type
Yes.
all over the English-speaking world, actually. I think the
Yeah.
first I heard of it was Yascha Mounk, the German-American political scientist, I think at Columbia. And he had a load of graphs a while back from surveys where they asked people, do you think your country needs a strong leader who could rule without bothering to consult Congress or whatever? And, Gen Z especially, a lot of people said, yes, I think that would be a great idea.
Yeah.
And it's kind of shocking because, I was someone who's, I don't want to reveal how old I am, but I lived some of my life during the Cold War. And at that time, it was very clear, and even some years afterwards, that we were liberal democracies in the West, and that was a good thing, and we had to defend democracy. And now there's increasing evidence, it seems, that young people don't feel this way. I will say as a caveat or a cavil that I have seen some sort of partial debunkings of some of these surveys. Like often the headline figure is very high, like 30% of young people don't like democracy. And when you dig into some of these surveys a little bit, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think that actually in some cases they actually ask people, do you like democracy? And actually majorities say yes. So I don't know how worried we should be, but I'm still a little bit worried that there are, even if there are kind of 20 to 30% of people who say we should have a strong leader who rules without parliament. If people are saying yes in those numbers, that's still concerning, right?
Yeah, I think so.
You might have to wonder to some extent if they knew what they were really being asked.
Yeah.
How well do they understand the mechanics of their governmental system and how authoritarian it really is to say that the president ought to be able to bypass Congress?
Yeah.
Well, okay, if you mean that like in a very strictly constitutional sense, that like the president should be able to have recourse to executive orders or something.
Which he does and has had for forever.
Yeah, so I guess you could take it in that sense. I suppose if I was asked that sort of in isolation, I would just immediately want to reject it because I would suspect surely they mean like a strongman dictator kind of figure, right?
But you're a scholar of democracy, so you understand those issues a bit better, perhaps, than some of the Gen Z people who are being interviewed.
Yes.
This is what I like to think, yeah.
And the other point is that...
Wait, how long? You wanted to
Sorry,
say something?
you go. No, you go.
Finish.
I'll come back later. Yeah.
I was just going to say that young people today haven't really had any, well, for the most part, haven't really had any introduction to democracy, what it means, how it works, like how participation in democracy, why it's important, how you exercise it, how you engage with all of that kind of bedrock knowledge is sort of just not there for our young people, right?
They haven't studied ancient Greek democracy at university, so... Actually, I joke about that as if it's irrelevant, but actually it is kind of something that inspires or informs my knowledge of, but also, to be honest, sort of advocacy for democracy, my affection for democracy, because it's had a long history, but it's had a very perilous history too, right? The ancient Greek democracies, there were probably, what do we think now? Probably dozens of them out there, but eventually these were eclipsed by the Macedonians and then by Rome, and then we didn't really get back to what we have now, which is a very different form of representative democracy, until really the very late 19th and early 20th century. And New Zealand actually has a good record of being a full democracy quite early with the granting of the vote to women.
But a lot of countries didn't grant the vote to women until the 1920s. So we're talking about a century of full democracy anywhere, apart from a few isolated cases like New Zealand. So it is a recent and arguably fragile phenomenon.
Okay, so I guess the natural follow-on question is, maybe with Trump, but also with this phenomenon of the young not seeming to understand or love democracy that much, what do you guys think the prospects are for democracy? And I would say, remind you, you obviously know this, but like that means also free speech too, because free speech and democracy
Absolutely,
often
yeah.
go
It's
together.
just
So
not
what's the
to kind
future
of-
look like?
Well, I think, I mean, democracy rests upon certain sort of environmental conditions, right? And principles, and the carrying out of those principles, and the sort of, I guess, taking on of those principles as individuals within society, right? And I mean, I see free speech as being the ultimate, at the bedrock necessity for democracy, and that, I mean, that's why personally I do what I do, because I think it's as important as it is. I don't think we can have a democracy without free speech.
I agree.
I just don't think it's possible.
I agree, and I also, I agree with what you said, that it would be good for young people to learn more at school about the nature of democracy, what's important to uphold it. On top of that, I would say that it's important to develop their democratic dispositions.
Yes,
it's not
absolutely.
just knowledge; it's having the kind of mental and emotional wherewithal to be able to engage with free speech effectively.
Yes.
And that means, the skills of listening to other points of view, of learning from people we disagree with, and not assuming the worst of everybody who disagrees with us.
Yes,
But
that's
as well as free
critical.
speech, I think there are other things that are necessary to safeguard democracy, one of which is giving all young people a stake in society. And so it connects to things like the housing crisis. If young people can't see a prospect of establishing a secure life and being able to raise a family and things like that, why would they sign up to this system called democracy that doesn't seem to do them any good?
Yeah, and to go back to what you said at the beginning, I mean, this is part of the Trump phenomenon, as you said. But I think that if people in a liberal democracy like New Zealand or anywhere else, have the feeling that they're going to get handed out of their jobs for telling a joke or for the things they've said, and there's essentially no recourse, whether or not that's true or not, if enough people feel that, then they're going to be very tempted, I think. I don't think this is actually a big risk in New Zealand, but I think it's certainly what's happened in the States. They're going to be very tempted by a figure who's extremely disagreeable. I think that's one way of putting Trump, right? The fact that he's an asshole, some people think, oh, this is great, this is our hope, because he's not going to be smothered by all these woke bureaucrats.
Which
And
is
that's
probably true.
And historically, this is what happened. And again, like, I sympathize with that view to some extent, but we have to be on our guard in a really serious way, because historically, that's the way that a lot of dictatorships have installed themselves. They've said, Pinochet said, Allende is a terrible communist, or that particular trope is a very common one. But there have been other ways of doing it. Maybe the communist dictators have said, capitalism is running riot. We need to rise up against the capitalist oppressors. So, and that rhetoric, even though maybe there were capitalist oppressors to some extent, and maybe the communists were doing bad things to some extent, and I do think the woke have been doing very reprehensible things to some extent. We really have to keep our balance and our wits about us and not go too far the other way.
And there have been some disturbingly authoritarian statements from Trump himself and some of his hangers-on. Musk, I believe, said, maybe we need a modern-day Sulla. For listeners who don't know, Sulla was a figure fairly late in the Roman Republic. You'll correct me where I'm wrong here.
Yeah, 90s BC, yeah.
And he took power by fairly dodgy means, and then he posted what's called his proscriptions, which were lists of names of people that he found undesirable, and it was legal to kill those people. In fact, you got rewarded by the state for doing so.
Yeah.
Have I got all that right?
That's right. And
so
they weren't. That wasn't just Sulla, by the way. I mean, also
Yeah.
Mark Antony later on. This is how Cicero got killed.
Right.
Well,
So we have Elon Musk saying we need a modern day.
Marius? Yeah.
We
Also
have,
Marius, yeah.
we have Elon Musk saying we need a modern day Sulla. Does he really think that we ought to be, making lists of undesirable people and executing them?
Yeah, that's scary. That's exactly.
It's a
what
very
I'm
good
worried about,
question.
Actually, I didn't realize he'd said that.
Can I just say something a little bit optimistic? So when I was at grad school studying not just classics but also political science, I remember reading this book, which was the head author was Jaworski, who was a famous Polish-American political scientist. And it was basically a large-scale sort of statistical study of democracy and authoritarianism in the world, I think since the Second World War. So he had a big data set, did lots of fancy statistical tests. And one of the things that they found, one of their most solid results, was that rich democracies are incredibly stable. In fact, he found this rule that no democracy richer than, I think it was something like 7,000 American dollars of GDP per capita per year,
Even all that,
which isn't even all that wealthy. It was something like Argentina in the year 1970 when their democracy was overthrown, one of the times the democracy was overthrown. No country with that level of wealth, which was a democracy, had ever stopped being a democracy. Now, obviously, he had, his data set only went back to the Second World War. And just because something has never happened doesn't mean it never
won't
will happen.
especially when you are talking about a fairly short time frame.
Yeah, but however, I'm sort of reassured by that. There does seem to be something very protective about development in democracy. In fact, before the sort of last crop of political scientists, for a long time, the leading theory in the study of democratization, how societies become democratic, was just that it's linked with development. Basically on the theory that people have a hierarchy of needs, and once their bellies are full and they're satisfied in other ways with life, then they start to value things like political freedom very highly. Now, of course, if you study ancient Greece, you realize that even at a much lower level of wealth, people can also come to value freedom and democracy very highly. But that does kind of reassure me to an extent. The other thing that reassures me is just the very long and solid tradition of not necessarily democracy too, but also kind of constitutional republicanism in the United States. And I know a lot of Republicans, large R Republicans in the United States, have sort of betrayed their principles and have gone with Trump. But my hope is, and I actually think it's sort of my trust at this point, my trust is that if Trump really tried to install himself for a third term, if he tried to do anything violent, that there would be a big backlash against him and the order would be restored and that people would actually go with the Constitution. That's my hope.
I hope that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, as well, I think we can reflect that despite the fact that since World War II, and certainly since the end of the Cold War, there has been a world order that is unprecedented in history and that we should be very grateful for. It hasn't been perfect. And America, as the preeminent power since World War II, has not behaved perfectly. There have been many excesses in Central America under Reagan and other presidents. In South America, they've had the illegal and stupid war that they started in Iraq post 9/11 on the lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and they knew it was a lie when they did it. That was a war criminal act on the part of the Bush administration and Tony Blair. So what my point is that we don't want to get too rose-coloured in our view of the past of democracy, even though I think that we all support it. We think it's well worth looking after. But when we contrast with a figure like Trump, we're not contrasting some kind of a golden age with an impending dark age necessarily. That the past is not perfect either, is my point.
No, that's true.
Oh, that's right. Do you want to add something?
Well, I was just thinking it might just, Trump is a phenomenon that represents a whole lot underneath, right? And I guess I was just thinking about sort of talking a bit more to that underneath if there's time and space for that, because that seems to me to be quite important too. What are the things that have led to this and how can we address those things?
Okay.
And I guess for me, something that I really think about is, like I was talking earlier about transparency, I think trust is another big one, and trust in our institutions. And I think this is why sort of gaining transparency in our political institutions and the sort of even lower down kind of councils that operate within, professional spaces is so important, which is part of why we're trying to do work in that space, because those are the spaces that individuals within communities look to and need to see sort of things being upheld the way that they should, and understand that they have a sense of ability to participate in those spaces, and also that they understand what's occurring in those spaces. There's a degree of transparency, and I think that's where we really need to be looking to avoid the kinds of things that we're seeing in America is to be shedding light in these spaces and understanding what's actually happening there, and sort of encouraging people that they can participate and they can get involved in these spaces.
Okay, great. So just to make everything totally clear and transparent to our audience. So you're talking about the work you do with the Free Speech Union when you're the relationships manager, stakeholder relationships manager. So you work with different groups. Can you maybe just talk briefly about that? These are professional organizations?
So that's part of our kind of motivation to get involved in professional spaces. So that means we've launched now 7 professional memberships and working on building up councils of individuals who can sort of be our advocates and our connections into these spaces, because we see them as being sort of like at the forefront of free speech in general in New Zealand, and really the culture making institutions and the spaces where we need to be actively working to regenerate open discourse and open dialogue. So this includes spaces like the media profession, the healthcare profession, religious leaders. We've also got lawyers. We've also got teachers, universities.
Yeah. So what's your sense from talking to some of these people in these groups who have concerns about free speech? Because my sense is that as someone who lives in Wellington and interacts with sort of the policy-making elite, my sense is that there's a lot of concern about so-called misinformation and disinformation and sort of extremist movements bubbling up from these organizations. And also there's a lot of concern to sort of embed certain moral and political values in the professional environment, right? So where people will say that they're committed to the Treaty of Waitangi, and that's obviously an important constitutional document in New Zealand. So what's your sense about how well that will go down in these? Do you think those things will produce good results, or is there a danger in them?
I think we're in, I really think that ship needs turning around quite quickly.
You said ship, just to clarify.
I did say ship. What I would say that I am seeing the most consistently across all of those professions I just named is a general movement towards a culture of conformity. So what the regulatory bodies and professional bodies are really trying to inculcate is a consensus culture where everyone agrees and thinks the same.
I mean, really, these councils, by that I mean the professional bodies, whether it's, architects or lawyers or doctors or whoever, what their job is to do is to set standards for the behaviour of the profession in professional contexts.
Yes.
It's huge overreach when they start saying things like, real estate agents need to practice tikanga or understand the treaty principles or whatever, because a real estate agent's job is to sell houses, and they should do so ethically.
Yes.
And that's about it.
Yes. So we're seeing, overreach is a great word for it. We're seeing a whole lot of this sort of moralizing rules kind of getting bled through these institutions and into these professions, and it's not actually.
But guys, I mean, come on, we're not racist. We live in a modern cosmopolitan society. We have to honor Maori. The Treaty of Waitangi was important. So, and sometimes people can say false things, and sometimes people can lie. So what's the harm? We want to try and make sure that people are saying correct things in our organizations and not spreading falsehoods, and also that we embody good values, right? Good moral values.
This is the greatest person of straw I've encountered for some time.
I'm glad you've used the term person of straw rather than some more antiquated terms. But no, what's wrong with that, right? I mean, a lot of people believe this. This is like, we tried to steel man the Trump view, but let's try and steel man the progressive view.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's true.
Well, the rejoinder would be from me that most professions, it's got nothing to do with these questions of the treaty or.
Yes, relevance is a big question.
Right? That's right. Again, a real estate job is to sell houses. A doctor or a nurse's job is to look after people's health. An academic's job is to attempt to discover the truth through a combination of evidence and argument.
Yeah, and to pass on the sort of view of what's true to the students.
That's right.
Yeah.
And anything beyond that is an undue imposition on them as professionals.
Okay, I mean, the reason I asked about your experiences of actually talking to these people is just that my sense is that, whatever the progressive arguments for these particular subset of moral views, we could say this even to the progressives who are pushing this kind of stuff. Isn't there a risk of a backlash in practice? That people just feel that there's something being forced upon them?
Yes, I think there's a real risk of that. I mean, what we're tending to be seeing more of is self-censorship and people just exiting professions. So I think we're losing a lot of really high quality professionals from all sorts of different professions just because they just don't want to participate in the moralizing dimension.
Well, I would say your profession, teaching, is possibly foremost amongst those. So we bleed a huge proportion of teachers in the first few years of practice.
Yes.
And that's because it's a hard job and they haven't been prepared for the classroom properly. But also, now there's a pretty heavy ideological overlay on what they're supposed to do and say in the classroom.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's something I've had my own personal kind of tensions and battles within myself about this. I don't think I could do it anymore because of my concerns in that regard.
It's kind of interesting. So in practice here, I guess what we're talking about in some ways are kind of two types of authoritarianism, right? So you have the type of top-down authoritarianism where it's Pinochet or possibly even Trump. Hopefully not. I mean, Trump isn't as overt a right-wing dictator figure as like Franco or someone like that.
Pinochet, Pol Pot, Stalin.
Well, I was
Mao.
thinking of just the right-wing ones for a start because I want to try and sort of delineate a kind of right-wing kind of authoritarianism and a left-wing kind of authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And we talked in our last Free Kiwis episode with Brandon McMurtry, PhD student at Massey. We talked about this new literature on left-wing authoritarianism.
That's right.
Previously, psychologists had studied really only right-wing authoritarianism, exclusively right-wing
But
authoritarianism.
I'd say we have to include Stalin
Right.
and Mao and Pol Pot as right-wing authoritarians in the sense that they're top-down. And
Well, that's certainly arguable and they're militaristic. But I mean,
yeah,
so then it's interesting, like, how do we characterize this woke phenomenon? It seems to be kind of authoritarianism just to the extent that it's people saying, you really have to say this and believe this.
Yes.
But it doesn't really act in the same way. It's not usually sort of you're being ordered to do this, and if you don't do this, I'm going to like put you against the wall and shoot you or something like that. It's more this kind of stifling insistence on social norms via kind of informal networks. Is that what you see, or do you see sort of more formal types of authoritarianism too?
I think that's much more what it is. That my sense of this kind of authoritarianism that we're seeing is that it's much more sort of behind closed doors, if you will. It's things that aren't obvious, and that's, I mean, self-censorship. We really don't have a gauge of how many people are currently self-censoring in their professional
Well,
context.
it
Because
works-
how
This is the nature of self-censorship,
how could
right?
we, right? It's inaccessible. So it's a real problem that this is not
and it works through
out there.
kind of social
yeah.
mechanisms and social
Exactly. Yeah.
disapproval and ostracism and those kinds of
Exactly.
things much more.
Yeah,
Very
and
subtle.
I should address
Very
that point of
subtle.
like, how do we even know it's there though? Because sometimes people say that to me about academic freedom. You know, you're saying everyone's self-censoring, so how do you even know it's a thing? And the answer is that when we give people the opportunity to say how they feel anonymously, they tell surveys consistently that they're worried about free speech and academic freedom. And also, there's a very consistent picture of what they're worried about in New Zealand.
Which
Treaty of
issues
white
they feel.
sex and gender and so on. So
Yes.
presumably you have, and we also have lots of testimonies from academics, personal experiences, lived experiences, they say. So presumably you also have, you've talked to a lot of people who come and say to you, I just want to be a teacher, I just want to be a nurse, but I'm being forced to sign up to these political views.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think, I mean, if there's any conclusion from this discussion, I think we all would agree with this. You know, we're all three free Kiwis. We're all liberal Democrats. We don't want authoritarians at all. We don't want authoritarians from the right. We don't want authoritarians from the left. And I think a great difficulty, a great risk at this point is that, you know, we sort of swing from one thing to the other. We think we want to avoid the authoritarianism on the left, and therefore it's very tempting to have an authoritarian
embrace it
of the
from
right.
the right.
But also I think that if we continue down this path of trying to stop what people are saying and making them believe certain things, even though it doesn't look like there's a risk of a Trump figure in New Zealand, you know, there didn't look like there was a risk of a Trump figure in the States 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And now there is. And so we don't want to go down that path, I
And
think.
so to me, the principle for us all to bear in mind, those of us who love liberty, whether that's free speech or freedom of association or the many other liberties that belong in an open society, is be prepared to defend liberty for those who you hate, for those who you disagree, for those who offend you. And
Yes.
if you are prepared to do those things, then you are a true open society Democrat.
And in some ways, I know it feels very difficult, but in some ways there's this very simple thing of just, and hopefully we've been able to do that okay in this podcast, of just trying to listen to the other side of the argument. Like,
Yeah, absolutely, and understand, right? Bring that kind of empathy lens to it. Like, why do you think the way that you think? And we only know that. We can only know that if we have the dialogue, right?
Be curious and
Curiosity.
and come to it with the possibility that you could learn something
Yes,
from
Yes.
people you disagree with.
yes.
I disagree with that completely. Okay. No, just kidding. Thank
you
you
both.
for being loyal viewers of Three Kiwis,
Three Kiwis.
whatever it's called.
See you next time.